Hello and welcome everybody to the Trees for All Achieving Equity in the Tree Canopy webinar. Thank you very much for joining us today. What you're seeing right now is actually a re-recording after the fact. At the start of the live webinar, I failed to hit record, so I'm just doing this as a bit of an insert. Rest assured that most of the presentation was captured. So I'm just going to fill you in on kind of what was missed, and then do a quick edit, and you'll be joining the presentation as it was presented live to all participants. We'd like to acknowledge that here in Waterloo Region, where I am today, and the Grand River watershed are located on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. We recognize the enduring presence of the Indigenous people that we share this land with today and their contributions to our community. We value their traditional knowledge about how to live sustainably on this land that we share and will leave for future generations. At Reep, we are committed to the necessary learning, relationship building, and actions to work towards reconciliation. At this point, I will launch into Josh Shea's presentation. So Josh Shea is going to talk about the sustainable urban forest strategy and tree canopy. To set the stage for that talk, the City of Kitchener recently came up and approved the sustainable urban forest strategy based on the 5 pillars that you see, specifically to protect, engage with the community, to plan first, and to maintain proactively, and to plant correctively and deliberately. At this point, I'll introduce Josh Shea, the Manager of Urban Forestry and Natural Areas Management for the City of Kitchener. He has over 13 years of experience working with the city to manage and improve Kitchener's natural heritage and urban forestry systems. And Josh we'll be talking about the 10 ways trees help us as a way to lead into talking about the tree canopy goals set by the City of Kitchener.
10 key ways that trees contribute to a healthy and sustainable Kitchener. But primarily when you're looking at tree canopy and the benefits that it provides, our goal is to be able to grow bigger trees. The bigger the tree, the bigger the benefit. So again, trees today do provide benefit, and the trees we plant and are planting as part of our program regularly, they're starting to contribute now, but as they grow and as they mature, their benefits increase and grow. It's important to kind of look at or understand when we're talking about tree canopy, what that essentially means. And so if you're looking down from the sky or looking from above towards the trees, the layer of branches, leaves, and stems that cover the ground when viewed from above. And it kind of looks like the image here. So in an area like this, you can see there is a significant amount of tree canopy, but you can see the other sort of non-covered or non-canopied areas as well. When we look at Kitchener specifically, we've done a lot of work to measure tree canopy to understand how and where it's changing over time. We compared a time period. We did an analysis in 2014, and we compared it again to an analysis we did in 2019 to determine what our existing tree canopy is and how it has changed and how we can forecast that to try and set ourselves a target to work towards. So the measurement, when we measured the tree canopy and we looked at how it had grown, it had actually increased between the period of 2014 2019 by 2.4%. With an existing tree canopy of 27.2%. So that's the full amount of area coverage across the city. And it compares relatively well to other cities, local areas, similar size, similar scope and capacity to what Kitchener is. So we're at or about average in terms of our tree canopy, our existing tree canopy target. When looking at how we manage and how we set our goals for the future tree canopy, it's important to understand how that what kind of factors or what exactly affects tree canopy to either make it go larger or make it go smaller over time. So tree canopy can change with a bunch of different factors. Some of those have an immediate impact or immediate gain, and some of those have a longer term impact or a longer term gain. So tree growth, so as trees mature, they grow. That is an immediate impact to how the tree canopy is growing over time. Natural regeneration, and we see that over a longer period of time as areas like natural areas, naturalized areas, areas which aren't intentionally planted, are starting to grow up tree canopy and mature over a time period. Our tree planting program, and this is probably one that gains a lot of the focus or a lot of the effort, is tree planting, but it's a longer term gain. When we're looking at what is affecting our tree canopy in terms of it's causing it to decrease or be impacted, tree mortality and tree removal are the two variables which have the biggest impact. And again, as I mentioned, tree planting is only one factor. Tree maintenance is probably one of the key or the biggest factors in terms of keeping it or growing a sustainable tree canopy. But in terms of tree planting alone, it is a longer term benefit. Just looking at a 1% tree canopy gain, if we set that and said we wanted to grow our tree canopy by 1%, it would take us roughly 1.3 million trees to be planted today to be able to achieve that 1% gain. Or if you look at that over a longer period of time, it would take us 40,000 trees to plant to gain that 1% over 20 years, or 18,000 trees to grow over 40 years. So as a tree, so you can see the trees are growing, their percentage increase or their gain is larger. When we looked at tree canopy and trying to set a target for our future to try and work towards, we used some best management practices. We used some targets that are set by other municipalities, and we looked at our own tree canopy and how it was changing and what we could forecast as a realistic change over time. And the goals that we set, the main one, which is comparable against other municipalities, is our citywide tree canopy, which is we're targeted and we're hoping to grow that by 33% by 2070. And obviously it's a longer term goal because trees are they take a long period of time to grow. But the other factor in our tree canopy target that we felt we wanted to take in Kitchener is to take more of an equitable approach by trying to set canopy goals for each ward. So all 10 wards across the city, we're looking to achieve a 30% tree canopy coverage by 2050. And that target was adopted by Kitchener City Council in 2022. When you look a little bit closer at tree canopy and the variability amongst various locations, it's not equitably distributed across the city. And you can notice there are some wards or some locations which have lower tree canopy, and some wards and some locations which have higher tree canopy. Obviously, the landscape or what is in those locations is a factor in terms of where tree canopy is higher or lower. But it ranges anywhere from 16.8% to 36.2% across the city of Kitchener. When you break it down a little bit further and you look at the planning committee, so that's just a smaller geographic location within a ward, there's even more variability, some which are even lower than the ward average of 7%, and some which are higher at 44%. And so our goal and our work is to try and focus our efforts in tree canopy, tree planting and tree maintenance and other activities to try and grow our tree canopy equitably. So essentially we won't be planting in all wards. We may be focusing on maintenance efforts or growing and keeping our large trees healthy to grow in larger over time. When you look at that existing 27% and our 30% tree canopy target, you can see the variability here. There's about half, more than half of our wards which are below that existing canopy, and a few that are above. So again, our work will be focused on trying to achieve 30% across all and 33% across the city. And I just pulled out a few examples of some of the ward locations, and I won't get into them all, but there's some wards which help to tell that story a little bit closer or a little bit clear in more clarity. So in some locations, if we want to grow tree canopy, we're going to look for public locations or public land where we can plant trees, and we're going to look for efforts where we can maintain our tree canopy. But in order to grow that canopy more or higher, we have to look for private locations and private land. And that's where, as Patrick mentioned in the introduction, there's partnerships like Reep, where we can reach out and engage the landowners to help plant trees on private property. So in a location like Ward 6, our efforts need to be focused equally on public land and private lands. And you can see the distribution above and below our current targets, kind of more planning communities are lower. Ward 10, for example, is where we have a little bit higher tree canopy target. Our existing canopy is 26.3, so slightly below the average. And it's an older area of the city where there's lots of mature trees. So a lot of our effort and a lot of our work is to try and keep those trees in healthy condition to continue to grow and provide benefit. But we also know and understand in locations like that, there's more soil volume on private lands where we can encourage and support private tree planting efforts, because the lot sizes are bigger and opportunities to plant trees are more available. In a location like Ward 5, which is one of our lowest or wards with the lowest tree canopy, our efforts will need to be focused on trying to find all available public space and or engaging and working with private landowners to locate and plant trees on private property. So you can see here where it's quite low. Again, our efforts to get from 16 to 30 will be require significant investment and significant focused effort. And then Ward 2, and this is another area where we have a lot of natural area properties or natural forests, which are helping to contribute to our tree canopy. So in areas like Ward 2, our efforts will be focused on managing and maintaining those woodlots so they're resilient against change and they can continue to have large mature tree canopy. So again, that's just a quick overview to help kind of paint the picture as to what the local landscape looks like and to try and understand or try to look forward in our work towards pursuing tree canopy through an equitable lens. So I'm happy again to answer questions throughout the evening tonight and or look for if anybody wants to connect, I'm happy to do that as well. So Patrick, back to you, and I look forward to the presentation.
Yeah, thanks very much, Josh. So if you want to stop sharing your screen there, we can get Dr. Nesbitt queued up. And just a reminder, if you do have a question, if you could submit it through the Q&A function. I'll monitor the chat as well, but I'll mainly be looking for the Q&As. So it's our pleasure to introduce Dr. Nesbitt. Dr. Nesbitt's work seeks to create more livable and equitable urban environments. She has worked with communities and organizations across Canada and internationally to achieve sustainability and environmental justice goals. First as a community-based environmental planner and facilitator, and then as a researcher. Dr. Nesbitt's research focuses on urban forestry and environmental justice using a social ecological lens. She is also interested in the role of urban forests in human health and well-being and nature-based solutions to climate change. So over to you, Dr. Nesbitt.
Thank you so much. Can you see my screen, Patrick and Josh?
We can see it. Yep.
Wonderful. Excellent. Okay. Yeah, thank you for that kind introduction. And really interesting to hear a little bit about what Kitchener is working on from Josh. It's nice to be speaking about urban forest equity with a city that is focused on that as part of urban forest management. That's very heartening. I am going to start by saying that I am coming to you from Vancouver on the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and I'm very grateful to be able to live and work in these lands. As Patrick said, my name is Lorien Nesbitt. I'm an assistant professor at UBC, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about what an equitable forest or urban forest might be. And I'm going to hopefully leave some time for questions because I'm very curious to hear what everyone has to say and thinks and your reflections on this topic. I also have a toddler in the background. I'm at home, so if you hear some child yelling, that's what it is. It's not a big deal. It'll stop eventually. I guess everyone who's a parent already knows that. So urban forests are certainly gaining a lot more publicity these days than maybe they used to be. So in BC last year, we dealt with the heat dome and some of the effects of climate change, and people started to understand how important urban trees are for our resilience and for dealing with urban heat, and also how important healthy urban forests are, because then they can then withstand some of these extreme heat events. During the heat dome, I spent a lot of time trying to find shade in my neighborhood. I discovered that one street was the best one to walk across and all the others really had insufficient tree shade. And I spent a lot of time at the pool with my kid. Of course, urban forests have also become or sort of, I think, gained more attention in public because of the pandemic, and a lot of the time that people have spent outside socializing, and some of the relief that people have found in nature. And so it's really interesting that I think it's great that urban trees and urban vegetation are getting more attention and care, and it means that we can take the time to think about how to do urban forestry in a way that serves all of the residents in our cities. I'm going to talk to you about urban green equity first, and a little bit about green gentrification. Then the idea of biocultural diversity, and talk a bit about a Vancouver case study. And then I'll suggest some pathways to equity and take questions. Just so we're all on the same page, I define trees and associated vegetation, or I define urban forests as trees and associated vegetation in urban environments. Some people also characterize them as tree-dominated urban ecosystems, urban green spaces. I tend to take a really broad view of what an urban forest is, and so this for me refers to street trees, parks, urban woodlands, cemeteries, golf courses, urban gardens, even green walls, architectural greenness, any of the vegetation that we see in cities and that we interact with in our daily lives. And of course, we're all aware, or increasingly aware, of the ecosystem services that these trees and other vegetation provide. I'm honestly becoming sort of less and less keen on the idea of ecosystem services, and I'm more interested in understanding how we can live in relationship with trees so that we can care for them as well. As we expect trees to protect us and help us adapt to climate change, I think we need to help trees adapt to climate change as well. And so, of course, thinking about these issues of the ecosystem services we receive from trees, people have started to talk about the idea of urban green equity. And this refers to fair access to and governance of urban forests, regardless of differentiating factors such as socioeconomic status, racialization, cultural background, or demographics. So any of those things that we use to differentiate ourselves or other people, and that set up power dynamics. There are some kind of key questions that I think researchers and cities and others are asking in the realm of urban green equity. And these are: what do we have access to? How do we experience that access? And how are our needs or values reflected in the urban forest landscape? And we're really only partway there. I'm going to talk about a couple of these, but we don't have all the answers yet, which is great for me because I get to do lots of research, but also it means that we need to do some thinking, I think, as a society. Oh, here we go again. So one of the things my computer does is it doesn't load all of the visuals on my PowerPoint right away. So if you see a blank screen, wait a moment and the text will appear. So one of the things that we're finding is that urban forests are often unfairly distributed. And there are different ways to measure this. One of the ways that some of the research that I undertook a few years ago was to look at the distribution of mixed vegetation, so all vegetation, the distribution of woody vegetation, so mostly trees, and the distribution of parks in 10 metro areas in the United States. And then I looked at whether these distributions were associated or correlated with the different demographic factors. So things like income, education, race, or other factors like age or neighborhood, sort of the age of the neighborhood that the trees were in. And we found that across many, but not all cities, income and education were positively associated with better access to especially trees, and to some degree parks. And in some cases, especially large cities, racialization was negatively associated with access to trees. In Canada, I recently completed some research with one of my graduate students that looked at the distribution of urban vegetation across 31 Canadian cities. And we found that there are diverse patterns of equity or inequity across cities. Certainly some cities showed very little evidence of inequity, which was a great finding. In about a third of cities, higher income or education predicted more greenness, and in a third of cities, but often different cities, having a greater proportion of millennials in the population predicted less greenness. certainly, I guess what this says to me is that analyses of equity really need to take into account sort of local context and understand some of the development histories that are shaping where people live and where trees are. And just to take a deeper dive into Vancouver, where I live, and another study that looked at urban forests, a study led by Ingrid Jarvis at UBC as well, found that neighborhoods that had higher residential instability, so more renters, material deprivation, so lower incomes, and ethnic concentration, so a greater proportion of non-white people living there, had lower access to public parks, lower exposure in their neighborhood to vegetation and water, and then higher exposure in their neighborhood to buildings and pavement. And we see more and more of this research being produced. I think sort of certainly there's more to be done, but we're getting a pretty good idea that there's at least the potential for inequitable distributions of urban forests across different contexts. I think there is a lack of research on this in some of the global south cities, but certainly in the global north, I think we're getting a pretty decent picture of this. Oops. So I guess I'm going to talk a bit about sort of who's doing what in relation to the distribution of urban forests and urban green equity. And one of the cities I like to talk about is Portland. Portland, I spent a lot of time interviewing urban forest practitioners there during my doctoral research. And I decided to spend all that time because Portland was one of the first cities to really include urban green equity in their urban forest management plan. So back in 2004, they were already thinking about distributional inequity. And more recently, they have this plan called Building Racial Equity Together. They work a lot with local community groups to do context-sensitive tree planting. They work with, so they sort of tap into what's already going on. They connect with faith groups to get people involved in urban forestry and urban forest stewardship. And they try to green low canopy neighborhoods in a way that responds to the needs of local residents. New York is also an interesting example. So New York, this is a picture of the High Line, which has been accused of causing green gentrification, which I'll talk about in a minute. But there's also really interesting grassroots-driven work going on in New York. And one of the examples of this is a project called Greening Greenpoint, which has since sort of wrapped up in terms of its funding, but I think it's an ongoing project in that the community has already created the structures to continue the collective work they're doing in related to community-driven greening. But in Greenpoint, which is in Brooklyn, it's a neighborhood that is a Superfund site, so it received a lot of money because of a history of toxic waste dumping in that area, and so they used that money to improve the neighborhood. And one of the ways in which they were doing that improvement was to plant trees. And so they did this in a very community-driven way where they set up a community advisory committee, had community leadership who used their social networks to get people involved in deciding how and where to plant trees, how to steward trees, to train people in urban forest stewardship, and to make it a really community-driven initiative, which is important because the neighborhood is also undergoing gentrification to some degree, and so they didn't want to implicate greening in that. And then, of course, New York City Parks, which is the responsible urban forestry manager municipally, has created a framework for an equitable future. And so they're very focused on equity as well, and increasing urban canopy in equity zones that are often defined by sort of unhealthy environmental conditions. And then in Detroit, which I was fortunate to visit a couple of years ago, there's some really interesting stuff going on around urban farming. And once again, there we go, my pictures are showing up. So in areas that have experienced a lot of degrowth and have a lack of food and other infrastructure, communities are getting together to create collective urban farms. And they link these urban farms across the city where they share seeds and share seedlings. And then this urban food production is linked with interesting initiatives around for example, food preparation, and also in the case of the Earthworks Urban Farm, a bicycle building and repair shop, because what you can grow in a garden is not the totality of the food that you need. And so if you live in a food desert, you also need transportation to get out of your neighborhood to buy things like milk or bread that you're not going to be able to grow in your farm. So I found that to be a really interesting example of kind of integrated and grassroots approaches to environmental justice. And then in Vancouver, we've been thinking about urban green equity more recently. It came out as sort of considerations of equity started to come out in the first iteration of the urban forest strategy, and more strongly in the 2018 revision of that strategy. And then in this document called Van Play, which came out in 2019, the city is taking an approach to environmental justice that looks at, sort of takes a mapping approach. And so they map gaps to park access, demand for low barrier recreation, and then urban forest canopy gaps. And you create this composite map that identifies areas for investment. They're also looking at areas of extreme heat that might need increased urban canopy. And then they kind of signal the need for community involvement, but it's not really clear how they're going to do that. So I think that's kind of where they're going next in terms of trying to understand how to meaningfully involve communities in shaping their urban forests, especially in low canopy neighborhoods. And this is particularly important because when we green underserved neighborhoods or low canopy neighborhoods, we run the risk of causing green gentrification. Green gentrification is defined as the physical or psychological displacement of marginalized or under-resourced residents due to improvements to urban forests that can increase the cost of living or create a sense of exclusion and barriers to urban forest access. And in a place like Vancouver, there's that is sort of easily gentrified because of the high cost of land. This is a particular concern. I'm not going to talk a lot about green gentrification today because it's sort of it's a topic that is being studied more and more, but it's not really clear how it operates, and it seems to operate in very context-specific ways. However, I'll just briefly go over a conceptual model that we recently published that can help sort of explain the ways in which green gentrification operates. So you see the red at the top there. One way in which green gentrification operates is through what we're calling conceptual foundations. And so this is the idea that green is always good, which is the green hegemonies box there. When green is always good, it becomes depoliticized, greening becomes depoliticized, and often sort of sustainability capital can be attracted by greenness. So for example, if you're doing a large scale redevelopment, if you plant a lot of trees or include an urban garden in that redevelopment, it sort of greenwashes the development, even though it may be displacing a lot of people. Then in this sort of blue area in the design and implementation, green gentrification can sort of continue to be perpetuated via processes that exclude and suppress local voices and create procedural injustices in the planning of a neighborhood or a development, where those who are most affected by the development are not involved in planning what it looks like or in being stewards of the urban forest that is being implemented. And then in the yellow here, you have sort of the most commonly understood area of green gentrification, which is socio-spatial change. It's a lot harder to measure actually, but the theory is that this is what happens when we have increasing real estate prices or increasing rents because of the installation of greenness, often with redevelopment processes that are ongoing. And this makes things too expensive for people to live in a neighborhood. And so they're physically displaced, they have to move. The other option is that as we redevelop a neighborhood and make it more green, those who are living there no longer feel a sense of place. The neighborhood is no longer designed for them, and they don't have a way to be stewards of the neighborhood in which they've lived. One of the reasons why I'm sort of trying to, green gentrification is a name for a problem, but it's not necessarily, the idea doesn't present a lot of solutions. And so one of the things I want to talk about is the idea that different cultures have diverse natures, I guess, and we don't always value nature in the same way or experience it in the same way. And I think this is part of why green gentrification is a phenomenon, because we have sort of capitalized urban nature according to a certain cultural model. And this idea of diverse urban people and diverse urban natures links to some of the challenges that we have in the urban green equity field. So we have diverse perceptions of urban forest quality, we have multiple approaches to stewardship, and then we have the current and historical marginalization that people experience in urban space. And these come together to create challenges in terms of understanding what green equity is and how to achieve it. One of the concepts that I have found really helpful in thinking through this is biocultural diversity. And this is the idea that we have an inextricable link between human cultural diversity and biological diversity, and where nature shapes human culture and human cultures shape nature. That we are not separate, we are together, and we grow and shape each other. And so one's bioculture is not static, it changes through your lifetime, and it's something that you can share with others, and it can be a site of intercultural exchange and learning. In order to explore this concept, I undertook a very sort of exploratory case study in Vancouver, not at all representative of the whole city, but just to kind of explore in a narrative way what some of the biocultures are that we have in the city. And I used biocultural diversity as a lens to understand what green equity is, and as a way to kind of address some of the conceptual challenges that we're facing. So in this exploration, I described 4 biocultural discourses or expressions. One is the ecosystem services model. One I'm calling Indigenous reciprocity and resistance. One I called Asian aesthetics, and the other the Three Sisters, and I'll describe them very briefly. So the dominant biocultural discourse that is very apparent in municipal and regional policies and planning histories is that of ecosystem services. And in this bioculture, nature provides services to humans, and there's a lot of sustainability branding and identity making in this way. And Vancouverism has been around for a while. So Vancouverism is all about how Vancouver is a livable place. And it's largely based on this idea of being green and of receiving ecosystem services. Of course, Vancouver exists on, on multiple Indigenous territories. And if you want to learn more about them, you can go to native-land.ca. It covers the whole country and is very helpful. And so one of the biocultural discourses I explored, probably not in enough depth, but in an initial way, is the idea of Indigenous reciprocity and resistance. And so this was characterized by reciprocal relations with nature and a holistic view of the urban ecosystem where nature and humans are not separate and all beings have rights and responsibilities according to natural law. There are lots of interesting examples of intercultural learning around this bioculture in Stanley Park, where Indigenous stewards share their knowledge and knowledge system with visitors. At UBC Farm, where there are teaching gardens, where cultures come together to learn from this way of viewing the world, and also where healing takes place. And in the downtown east side, where traditional or native trees have been planted with appropriate ceremonies, for example, to bring species back to the land that they were originally on. It's also a really interesting, or this bioculture is also the site of resistance to the Trans Mountain Pipeline in this region. And I think people often think about resistance in natural resource development as being a rural issue, but in fact, the Trans Mountain Pipeline runs through Burnaby, which is right next to the city where I live, and it runs right behind a lot of housing. And so there are Indigenous land defenders who are resisting the development of the Trans Mountain Pipeline because they are in relationship with the trees and other species who live in the area crossed by the pipeline. There we go, there's the text. The other bioculture that I think is really strong in this area is what I called Asian aesthetics. And so this is represented by some of the prunus species that we have as street trees that are a really strong part of the aesthetics of this city and represent a lot of the Asian heritage that has built the city. There's also the Dr. Sun Yat-sen Traditional Chinese Garden, which is really interesting. It's a place of intercultural learning that was modeled after Ming Dynasty gardens, but was created with local plant species to signal the intermingling of cultures in building Vancouver. And in this bioculture, the species and aesthetics of those species have cultural meaning, and point to both sort of historical as well as current cultures. And then finally, a case study I came across is the Maya and Excel Garden at UBC as well, which was established by Mayan refugee families in the mid-1990s. In these gardens, they practice traditional Mayan farming practices of reciprocity and care around the three sisters, which is corn, beans, and squash. Those are three species that are used across a lot of indigenous cultures in Latin America, actually in the Americas. And they've created this space of intercultural learning where they specifically invite non-Mayan people to come and volunteer and share knowledge, and they offer workshops because they have an educational orientation in their work. So we have all of these biocultures. What are some of the pathways to equity and resilience that we might pursue? I've been interested in this idea of mosaic governance, and I think it's a way to start to get at some of the issues of green equity and the importance of place-based work towards what that might mean. So multicultural cities have high biocultural diversity, and that diversity is growing and changing as we live together and share our cultures with each other and learn more about the ways in which we all relate to the non-human natural world. However, I find this diversity to be absent from dominant urban forestry discourses. And I think this is because we lack recognition, which is a key aspect of environmental justice, according to most sort of theories of what environmental justice is. It's a funny word, but I think it's a really important one. So recognition is typically defined as recognition of the diversity of people, communities, and their experiences, and the importance of their participation in urban forest processes, decision-making, stewardship. It's recognizing the value of people's experiences and perspectives and ensuring that they have power and respect in decision-making or stewardship or any type of sort of management shaping of the urban forest that we might engage in. And so I think that mosaic governance offers us a way to improve that aspect of environmental justice in our cities. Mosaic governance is the idea that we can have a mosaic of governance approaches across our cities and allow this mosaic to flexibly support different practices, cultures, peoples, institutions, local needs. It requires a convening institutional body like a municipality to provide leadership and also to have a commitment to context-sensitive governance, to work at the local or hyperlocal scale to support urban forestry that responds directly to the needs of communities. It's important that this sort of leadership, this central leadership role exists because we don't just want everyone to go off in their own silos and do their own thing. I think we have, as humans, a lot of shared values and shared needs as well as diverse needs. And so that sort of living together but in a diverse way is, I think, what we're kind of trying to achieve. Applications of this mosaic governance approach certainly need further study, and in Vancouver, there are current policies that highlight the need for citizen engagement or equity, diversity, and inclusion, but there's not a lot of operational approaches. And so I think we need more research on what this can look like on the ground. I want to end just with a quote from Jim Layden, who was one of the people I interviewed for this work, and who's just been a really helpful friend and colleague over the last few years as I sort of explore this idea of urban green equity. And he said, there's an old story that if you're out of center and you're feeling off, you would sit yourself under a big cedar tree and just lay there, kind of think or be, and ultimately the energy of the tree would center you and bring you back to a healthier headspace. If there were more trees, I think people would be more comfortable in their own skins, let alone their environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nesbitt. That was a lot in a short period of time. So
yes, it was.
So as I said, we're happy to take questions. There's been a few that have come in already. but feel free to type them in the Q&A function. So there's one here I'll direct to you, Josh, that came in after you presented. How can we increase tree canopy in downtown Kitchener?
Thank you, and thank you. I read that as it came in, and I've been thinking through my head as I was listening to Dr. Nesbitt's presentation. And it's a very good, valid question. It's a very hard question, and ultimately depends. And we heard a little bit about development patterns and development process. A lot of the downtown is a hardscape, and it's a hard place to grow trees. So we are looking for ways and opportunities to find space to grow trees on public property and in the streetscape, using various technologies and techniques. So that's one opportunity, is to increase our ability to grow in the hardscape. The other thing, and I mentioned this sort of a little bit in my presentation, is growing tree canopy involves keeping existing trees alive longer. And so our ultimate goal will be ensuring we're keeping what is existing tree canopy in the downtown healthy and alive and in good condition over time. So I don't have very specific or direct examples of opportunities. We heard a little bit, and I saw some graphics and some images, and I think it was New York City, innovative ways to grow trees, roofs, green roofs, other technologies, other opportunities. So those are always on options and to explore further. So I think this is kind of the starting point for Kitchener in terms of exploring more opportunities to grow trees or keep tree canopy growing.
All right, thank you, Josh. I think either one of you could take this, but I'll direct it to Dr. Nesbitt just to keep her on her toes. Somebody's asking, in addition to planting new trees to increase tree canopy, is there a way to accelerate the growth of existing trees?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think of this less as, I'm really glad you raised this, because we often talk about planting more trees and we don't talk a lot about maintaining the trees that we have, which I guess is much more boring, but more important in a lot of ways. So I don't think it's so much accelerating the growth of the trees we have. I think it's more ensuring that they survive, 50, 80 years instead of dying within the first 10 to 20, which is typically what happens with urban trees. So as much as half of the urban trees that are planted die within about 10 to 20 years, according to some research out of the United States. I'm sure that varies by city and by density, but I am also concerned that we're going to see more tree failure with climate change, with summer droughts followed by fall storms. And some of the research that I'm working on with Cynthia Gerling, also from UBC, shows that we're sort of creating these scenarios of future urban forests. And what we're finding is that it's really hard to increase tree canopy just by planting trees, because as you pointed out yourself, Josh, it takes a long time for a tree to grow, and it needs to survive all of these stresses that we're putting on it. The trees that are growing the best in our urban environment tends to be the ones that were planted a long time ago and had time to establish before all of the gray infrastructure was conflicting with them. So I think providing trees with more space, providing more proactive management, providing more funding for urban forestry, which is often an afterthought in municipal budgets, these are all important ways to maintain and grow our urban forest canopy with the trees that we already have. Trees aren't disposable, they're beings, we need to take care of them. I think we need to prioritize them a lot more than we do right now.
Thank you. I think this one too, it's directed, in the local context, but I'd love to hear your response to Dr. Nesbitt, in case you have information at a macro level or from other communities. But somebody's asking about, is there an opportunity to consider overlapping neighborhood level heat island mapping with socio-demographic data, i.e. vulnerable populations, to show areas of equity priority for tree canopy?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've started to do that in Vancouver. I think that one of the ways in which people understand the value of trees is as protectors of humans from urban heat. So yeah, that's being done. People are creating those composite maps that show areas of high heat and low canopy. I think that, just linking to the last question, it's important in those areas where we might be planting more trees, I think we also need to look at reducing gray infrastructure and focus management so that those trees we're planting can survive in extreme heat events or extreme temperatures and droughts over the summer. I mean, we had a crazy drought this summer, and I think that's going to continue. So I think that's one of the main ways in which people see urban trees being of benefit, and it's nice to see that kind of targeted planting in heat zones.
Great, thanks. Do you have anything to add from the local context, Josh? Or
Sure. No, I think just to build upon kind of what Dr. Nesbitt was saying about maintaining trees. So a lot of the focus locally will be on structural pruning trees when they're young, and then when they're mid-age, and then when they're older, so that they have good, strong structure and can withstand some of these impacts and some of these storms and some of these other factors like climate change. So if a good, healthy, structured tree is going to withstand some of those over time, soil is incredibly important. As I was listening to some of the presentation, my interest and my excitement was starting to peak, because I think we're just at our beginning phases, and our tree canopy target was approved in 2022. Our urban forest strategy was approved in 2019. Some of the ideas we were hearing are very forward thinking and very innovative that we're going to look to adopt. So the heat island mapping is something we've heard this a little bit before, but that mapping exists, but we just have to layer it upon our tree canopy program and our plans going forward. So I would say that's where the excitement in Kitchener is going to take off, is being able to layer our work upon some of these ideas to try and achieve these goals. So I think from my perspective, I was more so looking at this as a lot of exciting opportunities going forward.
Can I also add, one of my master's students just finished her thesis, and she was looking at urban trees for cooling and perceptions of those. And it's kind of obvious, but some of the things she found, I think we need to pay more attention to, and often equity is about linking systems. So for example, if we are planting trees to cool streets, we also have to have sidewalks on those streets, and those sidewalks have to be accessible to people with disabilities or mobility disabilities. And also kind of like asking trees to keep us cool without also providing proper housing infrastructure is not going to work. And so it's also thinking across sectors and cities that's important in terms of building resilience with urban forests.
Great. This one again, I think is directed locally, but I'd love to again get the zoom out and see what's happening in other communities if any of your research informs this as well. And the question is can there be a partnership between the city and residents to monitor the health of city planted trees? And there's more in the question. I'll let it go through, but I'll keep it at a high level there.
I think that is such a great question. I have been thinking more and more that what I should really be doing in my life is trying to connect people with trees and stewardship, which I'm also not good at, right? Like I should connect myself because everyone's busy and we're not always sort of sure what kind of stewardship we can do. But I don't think that we're going to grow healthy trees in cities without residents engaging in that stewardship. I mean, we can't expect that an urban forestry department is going to be able to appropriately steward the hundreds of thousands of trees in a city. And so if you see a tree that is, needing water in front of your house, you should water it. And people don't realize that that's okay, and that cities actually ask you to do that, especially when they're newly planted trees. And so trying to, I think, get residents involved in stewardship in an informed way, in an educated way, in a way where they can bring their own expertise and knowledge. I think that's got to be the future, and that also then provides some of those health benefits of interacting with nature in a more tangible way and in a more relational way.
Thank you. Josh, I'd maybe put the same question to you. I know there's some examples in nearby communities, but
Sure. I do know lots of people in our community monitor our trees because I get lots and lots of phone calls about various things about trees. So I know people are engaged. It's one of those subjects or one of those topics that people really, really love trees, and we hear about it all the time. And so part of what one of the goals of our urban forest strategy, or one of the outcomes or action items, was to develop this community kind of engagement, community capacity to engage people in urban forestry. And so that will be one of our goals going forward, is to try and develop that kind of program. And there's some different programs out there. Neighbourhoods is one that comes to mind, out of Alora or in Ontario. And there's some other ones where they've engaged people and taught them how to do some basic tree maintenance, and tree watering is one of the easiest ones, tree mulching. Things like that is something that we can certainly leverage community capacity and interest with municipal programs. And so it'll be another one of those type of growth moments where we're going to look to build as we go forward with our program. And I did hear Dr. Nesbitt mention funding. In the city right now is going into the budget request for our budget, and we have asked for a substantial amount of funding to support our urban forest program. And it'll be our first time, and one of our biggest asks historically, to say, like, this is an important aspect of fund, and we know we have a lot of supporters for that. So yeah, that's an opportunity for us to get the funding to then help put these pieces together. So I know I said it before, and I'll say it again, these are like excitement moments for us in the city of Kitchener to build on some of the ideas we're hearing tonight, to bring it locally into Kitchener, to make it happen. So there's lots of examples out there, and I think this is one of the key elements, is community engagement and empowerment or involvement.
Great, thank you. We'll just take a couple more questions. If you have, just a reminder to set type them in the Q&A. If we don't get your question, we'll try and answer it offline, but in the interest of staying on time, we'll just take a few more. So here's one, and I think this speaks to what you were saying, Dr. Nesbitt, about systems and thinking about trees. Tree canopy often conflicts with electrical and telephone wires, as well as construction of roads, sewers. So how can you balance this long-term in city planning?
Do you want me to comment on this?
Feel free, yeah.
Okay, I'll say something, and then Josh, you probably know more about this than I do. So I mean, there's two ways to think about this. One is right tree in the right place, and I know that the place changes, but certainly you have to do some good sort of design thinking to make sure that we're putting trees that are appropriately sized and appropriate species and growth forms in the right locations. I think the other is that we need to think about trees as beings that need care, and not as afterthoughts after we've done our great infrastructure. And that's in most cities, my understanding is that's how trees are often treated, and I don't think that's going to lead to a healthy urban forest. And I think we need to kind of get our minds out of this is what we've always done, so we'll continue to do this mode, and into thinking about how we can support cities how we can support trees while building cities that serve the people who live in them as well.
Mm-hmm. Anything to add, Josh? Or?
Yeah, and I think one of the key elements is, and this is it's a problem I think in a lot of municipalities, but it's breaking down our silos. I work in the urban forestry department, but I heard you speak so much about community planning and community building, and various aspects of that, equity, diversity, inclusion, factors, things like that we don't think of when we think I work in the urban forestry department, but they're so overlapping and so interconnected. And so, the city is doing a lot of work to break down those silos, to bring people together, to think about this in a city building lens as opposed to a forestry lens and a planning lens. So, those areas of growth need to take place and continue to occur. We also talk a little bit, we're working a lot on asset management planning. Gray infrastructure has very detailed asset plans that we know when a road gets too old, when it needs to get replaced. And we build that capacity into our planning, where we need to do a better job building asset planning into green infrastructure. So our trees are a key aspect of our asset plan and our asset program. And then interdepartmental working relationships, where I work with the engineers, or our team works with the engineers, the people who build our roads and the people who work on our sidewalks. Our road reconstruction program is probably one of the better examples, where we have forestry staff working on part of the engineering program and plan to ensure a reconstruction project considers and factors in trees in the design, but also in the construction and in the monitoring program, so that we don't just value one thing over the other. We find those opportunities to build in compromise, or to build in opportunity. So I think there's always areas for growth there, and that's one thing we're certainly focused on to help So it's not an afterthought, but it's an integrated, everyday thought. It'll take a societal change as well, and society will drive that change to ensure municipalities are caring for that. But I would say we have a community that cares about trees. To try and build on that as well going forward, I think would be a key piece.
Perfect, thank you. I think we'll leave it there in terms of questions. Aside from maybe Dr. Nesbitt, I'll give you kind of the last word, because as I mentioned, we went through things really quickly, and as you mentioned also, the science is still kind of evolving on a lot of this as well. So if you had like a major takeaway that somebody should, especially in terms of practical sort of, and it was great that you started to move into, solutions like that mosaic governance example. But if there was a major takeaway somebody had from this, what would you suggest?
Oh, that's a big question. I guess I think it is very exciting that Kitchener is embarking on this urban forestry plan and doing that in this informed and sensitive way. I think the more we can get communities involved in shaping what equity looks like and implementing it, the better off we are. And that links, that's from sort of the design of what urban forestry looks like at their local neighborhood to stewardship. And this requires engagement from community as well as from government, right? Like it's not, people have to also take the time to get involved and to become urban forest stewards and to contribute to their community and work with their municipality. And I know that people's lives are busy, but it's great to see people here at the webinar tonight. There's obviously some interest in this stuff. And I look forward to seeing what Kitchener does.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think we just scratched the surface, and I'd love to dig into this topic again at a future date. So thank you, Josh. Thank you, Lorien. That was super informative. I think I'm speaking for everybody when I say that. And thank you for everybody who came and gave us an hour of their time on a weeknight evening. So yeah. So thanks again, and this is our last webinar for the year. But if you go to our events page and subscribe to our newsletter, you'll be notified when we put on more either in person or online sort of events. So hope to see you again soon. And thanks again.
Thanks so much. This was great. Thanks, everyone.